Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome back to my channel, My Loverlies. If you've never been here before, thank you so much for clicking on my video. I am so happy you found me. I do so hope that you will like and subscribe before you leave. Become part of the Mama family. Mama's got your back, at least where makeup's concerned, and definitely when that makeup is cheap. Today is True Love Tuesday. We are talking about Mr. George Takei and his husband Brad. I learned so much I didn't know before. Mr. George is truly an exemplary kind of person. Before we get started, a very special, very warm welcome to any of those that are new to my channel. I am so incredibly happy that you are here. If you enjoy the content, I do so hope that you will mash that thumbs up button. I hope that you will subscribe if you have not already. And I hope that you will ring my bell, turn on your notifications, so that way, next time I upload a video, you can come right back here and we can hang out together again. Also, my eyes are already done. I used the Transluce Beauty The I Am palette. This is such a stunner. I'm trying to feature a palette every single week. I'm trying to go through my collection and use palettes that just do not get enough love from me. So what I've been doing is taking a palette I don't use super often and doing 3 looks out of it. Guys, if you are not following me over on TikTok, you definitely should go do that. I've been posting looks over there non-stop. I do post fun content every single day. And if you're following me everywhere, you don't have to worry about missing a single moment of it. Guys, I will make sure to have the list or to have the links to all of my other socials, Facebook, Instagram, all that good stuff listed in the description box below, along with a full product list of everything that I'm going to use in today's video. And of course, if you have any questions about what I'm using or how I'm using it, all you have to do is leave me a comment and I will get back to you. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the love story. If you've never been here before for True Love Tuesday, I sit here, I tell you an epic love story while I do my makeup. This week, we are talking about the mostly unheard love story between George Takei and his husband, Brad Ullman. This is such a beautiful, beautiful love story. It is not spoken about enough. If you're anything like me, you had no idea about it. George Takei is truly just a freaking Hollywood legend, right? The first thing we think of when we think of him is Star Trek and that super deep, smooth, like radio kind of voice, right? He's a living legend. Not only that, he is a true pioneer, he is a trailblazer, and he's had an incredibly difficult life as well. I learned so much researching for today's video, and I am super excited to get to share all of my new knowledge with you guys. So I always sit here and I talk about each half of the whole, and then we'll get into the love story of them together. Now, there's not a ton of information out there on Mr. Brad. He's just behind the scenes kind of guy. So I couldn't find a ton of information on him. However, today's story really is going to center on Mr. Takei because his life, y'all, there's a lot to go over. Now, there aren't too many there's not a ton of notes on today's video. If you see me looking over in this direction, it is because I am looking at my notes. We've got about 6 or 7 pages of notes today, so I'm hopeful that we're not going to be here for too awful long. However, you might as well sit back, get comfy, get cozy, get you a big old glass of something to drink. I am drinking some sweet tea, and let's go ahead and dive right into the story. George was born Hosato Takei on April 20th, 1937. He was born in Los Angeles, California. He is a Cali boy, born and bred. He was born to Japanese American parents. His mother, Fumiko Emily Nakamura, was born in Sacramento, California, while his father, Takekuma Norman Takei, was born in the Yamanashi Prefecture. Now, his father worked in real estate, and fun factoid, actually, he named his son George after King George, whose coronation happened just a little while after little George was born. Now, George's early childhood was fraught. Absolutely fraught with worry and uncertainty. Now, at this point in American history, The world is falling apart, y'all. The world is absolutely falling apart. It is not a good place to be or live. This is pretty much right smack dab in the middle of World War II. So Hitler is definitely doing his thing. It's not good. And starting when George was around 5 years old, his life got really, really difficult really, really quickly. Now, all of George's problems pretty much started with the signing of Executive Order 9066. Now, if you're anything like me, this foundation is so yellow. If you're anything like me, you won't have any idea what Executive Order 9066 was. Be patient. I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, it's not something that is, it's not in American curriculum. Like, it's not something I learned about in school. And the only reason I can think of that it isn't is just because we're not very proud of it. It's a really, really awful, awful thing, and it's an awful thing that the president did. Now, at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt was the president. Now, and he signs this order, and it completely uproots hundreds of thousands of people, and it basically puts them in war camps, and it's freaking awful. So after Executive Order 9066 was signed, the Takei family was forced to live in the converted horse stables of Santa Anita Park before being sent to the Rower War Relocation Center for internment at Rower, Arkansas. Now, what was Executive Order 9066? Y'all, it was an affront to human decency. It was a shit show. I don't cuss very often, but that's exactly what this was. This was a complete and total just annihilation of human rights. It was freaking awful. So it was a United States presidential executive order signed and issued during World War II by United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, this went into effect on February 19th, 1942. Now, this order authorized the forced removal of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to relocation centers, and that's in quotes, relocation centers further inland, resulting in the incarceration of almost all Japanese American citizens. Y'all, this is truly, it is a racial hate crime of epic proportions. Now, this again is not something that I knew before researching for today's video, but apparently Mr. Roosevelt was notoriously racist, and a lot of his racism was really aimed towards Asian Americans, right? He just didn't like him, didn't want anything to do with him, and didn't want them here. Now, when Pearl Harbor happened, all of that good stuff, right? President Roosevelt took this as an excuse to just do some serious damage. Now, 2/3 of these Japanese American citizens were actually U.S. citizens, born and raised here. The order was consistent with Roosevelt's longtime racial views towards Japanese Americans. After about 3 years of these Japanese Americans, of all of these families being forced to stay basically in these prisoner camps, the executive order was suspended, and the government started to kind of release all of their prisoners and let everybody go home. But by this time, they had stripped literally everything from these people. They had taken their homes, they had taken their jobs, they had taken any money that they may have had saved. Like, these people were left with literally nothing. They were left with nowhere to go and nothing to return to. So like I said, in December of 1944, Roosevelt suspended the order after a decision was made by the Supreme Court. And that decision is known as Decision Ex Parte Endo, and detainees were released often to resettlement camps or resettlement facilities and temporary housing. Now, again, they had to go to temporary housing because they had nowhere to go. After they had been basically they'd been held prisoner for years at this point, and everything they had left behind was no more. Detainees were released, and all the internment camps were shut down by 1946. So in the case of George's family, their story is it's absolutely devastating. So the internment camp George's family was sent to was located in the center of swamplands and surrounded by barbed wire fences. Like, these were not happy places that these people were being sent to. They were genuine, basically prison camps. Like, the president wanted these people to be as miserable as he could possibly make them. He tore them away from everything that they knew and everything that they owned, and he put them in these awful, awful conditions. Like, they barely had enough food. There was, like, it just, I can't even comprehend the true awfulness of this situation, because thank my lucky stars, I have never had to deal with anything like this. It's just the thought of this, like, I had no idea that this had happened. The thought that this happened in my country, the thought that the leaders of my country could have been so cruel as to allow this to happen is devastating to me. So they are surrounded by swamplands and barbed wire fences. Now, George remembers the day his parents, his brother, and his baby sister and him were forced from their Los Angeles home, and it was burned into his memory. He said, "They stepped on the front porch, and with their fists they banged on the door. My father answered, and they pointed their bayonets at all of us and told us to leave." Now, George was only 5 years old at this point. Could you imagine being a 5-year-old baby and seeing men, soldiers, with guns on your front porch, pointing them at you, telling you that you needed to leave your home and leave everything that you love because you're not allowed to be there anymore? I can't even. It just makes me so indignant. It's so, so awful. The terror of that morning was seared into his memory. They had to live in a horse stall in Santa Anita Park, and then they were taken by train to Arkansas. Now, again, they really don't understand why this is happening. Like, they kind of know why this is happening, but it's so awful that it's really just not computing. And you have George's parents, who have 3 children that they are desperately trying to keep calm and desperately trying to reassure. You have these children who are scared out of their minds. They don't know what's going on. So George's father tells his children, he says, "You know what? We're just going on a vacation, right?" So after they are kind of removed from the Santa Anita horse stalls, they're put on a train, and then they're taken to the swamps of Arkansas. Now, while they're on the train, this is when George's father tells them that, you know what, we're going on a train ride. We are going on a very long vacation. We're going to the countryside, and we're just going to relax, right? And this kind of placates the children just for a little bit. They're like, okay, maybe it's not going to be so bad. Maybe it's not going to be so scary. However, as soon as they get off the train, like the train that comes to a stop, they get off the train and they're greeted by very mean looking soldiers. Everybody is armed. Everybody is looking at them like they are the scum of the earth. There's barbed wire everywhere. It's just awful. Everything is gray. Nobody is smiling. It's just scary. And at that moment, even at only 5 years old, George knew that this was no vacation. He knew that this was something much more serious, and he was scared. They were eventually taken to Tule Lake in Northern California. They were moved from the swamplands and then taken back to California. So they were a little bit closer to home. Still not home, though, for sure. They were taken to Tule Lake, a camp for the supposedly disloyal. And you might be asking yourself, now how did they judge who was disloyal and who wasn't, right? Well, apparently there was a survey done by the government. It was administered by the government, and these people were surveyed, and of course the survey was incredibly flawed, right? It basically, the odds were stacked against them. It would have been very difficult to not have been judged as disloyal. Nigh impossible, really. So everybody was disloyal. And it was basically just an excuse for Roosevelt to treat these Asian Americans as horribly as he possibly could, while still maintaining that it was for the good of the country. Now, of all of the internment camps, things like that, Tule Lake was the very, very largest of them all, and at its peak, it held 18,000 people. 18,000 people, and this is just one camp. 18,000 people who had been uprooted from their lives and their homes and had been shoved onto this tiny piece of property and told, behave or bad things are going to happen. Absolutely awful. Now, thankfully, they didn't have to stay here for too awful long, just a few years. And then, like I said, by 1946, all of the camps had been disbanded, I guess, or they had been taken down, and people were allowed to return to their lives. Now, unfortunately, by this point, everything that George had known before before their lives had been uprooted, it didn't exist anymore. The government had taken their bank accounts, like I said, they had taken their homes, so they were returned to the world with nothing. So George's mom and dad really had to scramble, and they really had to figure things out because there was nowhere to go and there was nothing to fall back on. George says that his family worked his mother and his father worked their fingers to the bone trying to build back some kind of life for their children. And you have got to hand it, George's father was a leader among men, because not only did he take a leadership role while they were at camp, he helped as many people as he possibly could. But when they got back into the real world, George's father continued to advocate. He continued to advocate for his people, and he really taught George to not hold that against the entire world. He really tried to impress upon George that this one instance does not mark all of mankind. Not all of mankind is awful. And he really, really encouraged George to take charge of his life and be active in his community and be civically active, right? Make sure you know who you're voting for. Make sure you know who is making decisions for you. That kind of thing. And George took this to heart. Now, like I said, George's parents, they worked themselves to the bone trying to build up some kind of life, and they were incredibly successful. They worked hard enough that they were eventually able to own and operate a dry cleaning service that they then sold for a decent profit. Then they also opened up a grocery store, and y'all, they just were incredibly smart and hardworking and just were really able to take a bad situation and turn it into something that was beneficial to them and their family. Now, after the internment camps, George's life became very, very normal. After that very big bump in the road, life went back to normal, or as normal as it can be after something like that happens. And George went to school, and he took the words of his father to heart, and he really got involved. And of course, at that age, you can't really be involved in government, things like that. You're not old enough to vote, things like that. But he took a big interest in his student government. Actually went on to be the boys' senior board president at Los Angeles High School, and then beyond that, he's just always been very politically active. After graduating high school, George went on to attend the University of California, Berkeley, and he studied architecture there. He later transferred to UCLA, and he earned a Bachelor of Arts in Theater in 1960, and then eventually went on to get his master's in the same subject in 1964. Now, when it comes to George's career, y'all, we all know his big claim to fame is Star Trek. Now, while that is the first thing we all think of when we think about Mr. Takei, it is not the only thing he has ever done. He began his acting career in the late 1950s doing a lot of voiceover work, and this is what really broke him into the business. Y'all, that voice, it is so unique, and it was really, really quite in demand. Nobody else quite sounded like that. On top of the fact that Hollywood still was a very, very racist place, especially when George first got there, and acting roles and opportunities for Asian Americans just were kind of non-existent, right? Unless you were doing some kind of niche or that kind of film, like if you were doing a racial film, something like that, there just weren't a lot of roles available to Asian Americans. Now, he lent his voice to a few of the Japanese dubbed versions of Japanese monster movies, like Rodan and Godzilla. What was it? Godzilla Raids Again, things like that. Now, he eventually broke into film, and he starred alongside Frank Sinatra in Never So Few. He starred beside Richard Burton in The Ice Palace. But of course, like I said, we all know him from Star Trek. And Star Trek is really, it turned out to be the defining role of his career. Throughout his career, and y'all, he's been working in Hollywood for a very, very long time. Throughout his career, he has starred in quite a few different iterations of that same show. He was in the animated series, he was in the first 6 Star Trek films, that kind of thing. And it's provided quite a platform for him to kind of jump off of. Now, throughout his almost 50-year career in Hollywood, he has 221 credits to his name. When I tell you this man worked and worked steadily, I am not lying to you. And not only that, y'all, but he has found quite a bit of fame on the internet as well. He actually has quite a large internet following. He is on TikTok. I don't know if he's on TikTok. I do know he's on Instagram, though. Has a giant Instagram following. He's also an author. Y'all, he's just basically been there and done that, and is genuinely a legend. He is a Hollywood legend, and on top of all of that, he is also a giant advocate for the LGBTQIA plus community. He is very devoted in making sure that everyone is treated equally. That is a big, big thing for him, and he believes that everyone deserves, it is a human right, to be able to just live and be the person that you want to be and not be treated differently for it. And I agree with him 100%. Now, like I said, there's not a ton of information out there on his significant other. I was able to find out that he was born Brad Elliott Altman on February 25th, 1954. He is a whopping 17 years younger than Mr. Takei. Now, I will say that Mr. George has aged like a fine wine. That man, I swear to you, he's like 80-something years old at this point, and he looks like he could be like 60. Like, this man ages in reverse, and it's freaking insane. But yes, Brad is a whopping 17 years younger than Mr. Takei. He was a producer, a journalist, a writer. I believe he was working for a newspaper when he met George in the first place. And y'all, the way that they met, like, their story is so freaking adorable. It's so freaking adorable. Now, I know this story has been kind of heavy up until this point, but this is where it gets so much better. Brad and George first met at an LA Runners Club. So there was a club called LA Front Runners in Los Angeles, California, and Brad was already a member. George decides one day he wants to start like practicing because he wants to enter his first marathon. So in 1984, he walks into this club. It is an LGBTQIA+, make sure I'm getting all the initials in there. It is an LGBT runners club. It is for gay people to mingle and just be with each other and be comfortable, right? Because again, back then it was not quite as widely accepted as it is now. It was a safe space. And George walks in, and at this point, he is still very firmly in the closet, more so professionally than in his personal life. So he walks into this club, and he joins, and as he's there, he's kind of like eyeing the place out, trying to get the lay of the land. And all of a sudden, his eyes fall on the most beautiful man he has ever beheld. That very, very beautiful man just so happened to be Mr. Brad Allman. And y'all, he is in his physical prime. He is your very stereotypical hot guy, right? He's tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, muscly, the best runner at the club, and George is instantly smitten. Now, of course, the attraction is not one-sided. Mr. Brad gets an eye, he gets an eyeful of George and is instantly like, "Who? What have we here?" But Brad is very shy. Brad is very shy. For all his big bad buffiness, beefiness, he is not going to make the first move, right? So George is sitting there. He's waiting for Brad to come up to him and say something. Y'all, they've been like eyeing each other up and down for days at this point. And George is just tired of waiting. So what does he do? He ends up making the first move. He goes up to Brad and he asks Brad, because again, Brad is the best runner in the club. He's the fastest guy in there, and George is going to use this to his advantage. So he goes up to Brad and he asks Brad if he will help train him, because of course George wants to enter his first marathon. So of course Brad accepts. He starts to train George, and the more time they spend together, the better things get. Now, of course, it didn't take long for training sessions to turn into the conversation turns more from running to more personal subjects. And then these training sessions turn into hangout sessions, which turn into dates, right? And what was once more of a friendship becomes a relationship. Inevitably, things get steamy and they go out on a couple dates and they decide, you know what, we work really well together. I really like you. Let's be together. So they start going steady, and Borge is born. Now at this point, George, like I said, is still very firmly in the closet, and so is Brad. You got to think about the times being very, very different. Again, this is only 1984. And on top of that, y'all, big things are happening in the world. And progress is happening, but it's happening slowly and surely. Now, in his personal life, George was a little bit more lax about his preferences and things like that. But professionally, George was definitely in the closet. It was not something, his orientation was not something he spoke about. He didn't lie, but it wasn't something that he spoke about. He just kind of either evaded the question or just didn't answer, or maybe changed the subject just a little bit. It wasn't something that he was very open about at all. And especially back in the day, being openly gay was like a death sentence, especially if you were in Hollywood and an actor. That was a really quick way to end your career. So it's just not something he spoke about. But most people knew. It was a pretty poorly kept secret. People pretty much knew, but because he never openly admitted it, there was still some doubt. Now, Brad and George's relationship got pretty serious really quickly, actually. You know when you meet somebody and you just instantly click? Well, that was Brad and George, and very soon after they started dating. Now, at this point, they're not monogamous. It's just a choice that they made for themselves. They're not monogamous, but they are definitely together. They're definitely a couple. And very quickly thereafter, Brad starts helping George. Now, a little something to know about Mr. George is he's kind of helpless, right? A lot of that stems back to his childhood, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But George needed a lot of help, especially managing the business side of things. George is a very open, free, kind of creative kind of person. However, scheduling and organization, things like that, are not his forte. And this is where Brad comes in. Because even though Brad is 17 years younger than Mr. Takei, he's a cougar, by the way, even though he's 17 years younger, he is incredibly organized. He works for a newspaper. He is an investigative journalist, I believe, at this time, something to that effect. So he's definitely, he's very smart. He's very organized, very talented as well. And slowly but surely, he begins to do little things here and there for George until all of a sudden he just realizes that, dude, I'm your business partner. I'm basically your business partner. He began helping George with some of his public relations, his press releases, things like that. He really was helping to keep George on time and keep him organized. George really just needed someone to make sure that things got done, right? Because he's very forgetful. He's just not good at keeping up with things, right? The tasks that Brad was doing for George, the job title slowly evolved until eventually Brad became George's business manager and quit his prior job and kind of devoted himself solely to George and managing his career. Now, at this point, this is when they decide that it's time to move in together, and that's exactly what they do. As much as Brad is already managing George's professional life, he might as well manage his personal life too, right? So, Brad and George move in together. Everything is fantastic. They are loving life. They are loving being together. And on the day that Brad moves in with George, he walks into George's townhouse, and it's an estate, first of all. Second of all, he walks in, right, and there's kind of like a big pile of dirty clothes in a bag by the door, right? Not that the house is messy by any means, just kind of untidy. But there's a big bag of clothes by the door, and Brad is like, why are your clothes in a bag? Why are they not in the washer? Well, Brad goes on to hunt for the washer and dryer and finds a brand new washer and dryer set with the stickers still on it. And mind you, George has been living in this townhouse for a good long while at this point. This washer and dryer, though it's brand new, it's not brand new to George, right? So Brad is trying to figure out what's going on. Come to find out that George's mother still does his laundry. She still comes over and cleans his home and cooks him meals and things like that. George had a little bit of trouble. There's a little bit of like failure to launch there, right? Well, it's not necessarily just George's fault. So remember how he spent quite a few years of his youth, his whole family did, in internment camps? Well, during that time, George's mother's ability to take care of her children and her home and like do the motherly things to express her love, that was completely and totally taken away from her, right? She couldn't cook for her children. She couldn't wash their laundry. She couldn't tuck them in at night. And as soon as they got out of the internment camps and were back on their own and, back to real life, she never again took those small tasks for granted. She actually kind of clung to them, right? And as a mother, I can 100% understand why she would do that. It's those little things that you do as a mother to express your love to your children that once you can't do them, like it leaves like this big gaping wound in your heart, right? So once she was finally able to do that for her children again, it was something that she really relished and she cherished it and just continued to do it. And it was easier for George to just let her do it than argue with her and say, I'm a big boy now, I can do it my own. So you have this 40-something-year-old man, I think he was 48 at the time. You have this 48-year-old man who's never done a load of laundry, Now, even though being outed was a gigantic worry for them, HIV was it was like a black cloud that hung over everything. Right after Brad and George met is kind of when the AIDS epidemic really reached its zenith, and it was at like the peak, right? And testing wasn't really available. It wasn't very accessible at all. So you had all of these gay men scared out of their cores, wondering if they were positive. They're not knowing their antibody status, just really not knowing what's going on with their bodies. And because of that, George and Brad, they were just really, really terrified. When AIDS started getting really, really bad, they decided that they were going to become monogamous, right? Because at that point, they still don't know. They don't know if they're HIV positive or not, but they know the best thing they can do is to minimize their partners and be as careful and practice safe sex procedures, right? So they lock it down. They become totally and completely monogamous. Very shortly thereafter, they go and they get tested, and they both find out that very, very luckily, they're both negative. Neither one of them have the HIV virus, and it's like this giant relief. However, not all of their friends were that lucky. So many of George's friends unfortunately passed away during this point in time, like during this span of time, and George has a memory. He spoke about it in an interview where he went to the hospital. One of his friends who was suffering with the virus, he went and he checked on him at the hospital. And he arrives at the hospital and walks into his friend's room. And his friend is on the bed, curled up in the fetal position, absolutely just shivering and shaking. And all the while, there are nurses out in the hallway, completely ignoring him, just chittering and chattering away, giggling and gossiping. And George lost his freaking mind. Maybe I would too. Like, they're completely and totally ignoring his friend, who is obviously miserable and in need of medical attention. So he yells out into the hallway. He said, "Get him a blanket." Like, George is mad. And at this point, this is when George decided that he needed to really take a stand. He had not only the platform, but the voice to be able to make a difference. And he was able to advocate for his people. While Brad and George got lucky and never contracted the virus, that didn't mean that it wasn't important to them. They worked very, very hard to help all of their friends. If anyone did come down with a virus, they were there to help. And like I said, George advocated. Like, even though he was not able to speak about it publicly because he was still in the closet, George wrote check after check after check to organizations trying to find a cure, trying to find a way to help. He supported the cause in any way that he could. And through this whole thing, George and Brad are getting closer and closer. They definitely had that physical attraction, that physical bond, but trauma bonding, honestly. So they lean on each other, and they lean on each other for emotional support, for mental support. Their friends are dropping like flies. There's nothing they can do about it. It's so much loss and so much pain. And this just kind of it sticks them together like glue. Now, you might say, what, did they ever want children? This was a question I had. George says never having children is his biggest regret. Now, he was worried back in the day. Again, so different. Times have changed so rapidly and so very much in just a couple of decades. It's absolutely insane. But back then, getting a child, adopting a child, or, having a surrogate, something like that, for a gay couple was notoriously difficult. On top of that, they, again, were still in the closet, and George was worried that a two-father household wasn't the right environment to raise a child in. There were just a ton of factors that went into their decision to not have children. However, like I said, it has always been George's biggest regret. Both George and Brad, they both wanted children so badly, just wasn't something that they ever thought that they could achieve. However, George does have brothers and sisters, as does Brad, I believe. So they absolutely spoil their nieces and nephews rotten. And they live vicariously through their siblings, and they take their nieces and nephews every so often, just to spoil them rotten and send them home. Now, George and Brad lived like this together for a very, very long time. Almost 2 decades they lived together as life partners, but this entire time they were unable to share their relationship and share their joy with anyone else because, again, they were very firmly in the closet. Well, that all changed in October of 2005. And you might ask, well, after all this time, why? Why did George finally decide? What made him finally decide to come out of the closet? And y'all, it was anger. It was anger. Arnold Schwarzenegger, I believe at the time, was the governor of North Carolina. He was the governor of California, and he had just vetoed a bill that would have legalized same-sex marriages, right? And I believe, and this made George mad. He didn't understand why it was still such a big deal. Why was it such a big deal to let people just love the way that they wanted to love, right? Like, they weren't hurting anybody. They weren't doing anything wrong. Like, there was nothing wrong with it. So he went on and he went into an interview with Frontiers magazine. and he came out of the closet. Like, this was such a momentous, monumental kind of moment, because again, while it had been suspected, he had never confirmed nor denied it, right? So he goes on record and he says, I'm gay. I have been gay almost my entire life. My business manager is my life partner. We've been together over 20 years at this point, and I don't agree with what Arnold Schwarzenegger, I don't agree with what the governor has just done. He was mad. However, this was such a freeing, it was such a, liberating kind of moment for George. You have to realize that for most of his life, he has been hiding one of the biggest parts of himself. He has had to be so careful, and he's not been able to be exactly who he was. And on top of that, he's had to hide an 18-year relationship he's had with the love of his life, and to finally say it out loud, and to finally just let the world know, he felt like this giant weight had been lifted off him. And after he was finally truthful, he finally understood what it was like to be completely himself and to have nothing held back. He was finally honest with the world, and there was no going back. Just one day after the California Supreme Court finally lifted its ban on same-sex marriages, George announced his plan to marry his partner, his life partner for the last 18, 19, 20 years. He finally announced that he was intending to marry Brad Allman. They found out the ban had been lifted, so they're both sitting at their kitchen table, they're eating lunch. George has just taken a big giant bite of his food, and all of a sudden across the radio comes the announcement that the declaration has been signed, the ban has been lifted, and same-sex marriage is now legal in the state of California. He is about to jump up and start celebrating when all of a sudden Brad slips out of his chair, gets down on one knee, and is like, "Baby, will you marry me?" Right? And George is like, yes, of course. It's such a special, fantastic moment, right? But George, with a mouthful of food, is like, oh, you beat me to it. I was going to ask you. They wasted absolutely no time in obtaining a marriage license. And on September 14th, 2008, after 21 years of sharing his life with a man he had to hide, with sharing his giving his heart to a man that he could not tell the world about, George and Brad finally got married. George was finally able to marry the love of his life. George and Brad got married at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, California. Their ceremony featured elements from a bunch of different cultures. They had the Japanese K-pop harp playing along with the bagpipes. They had a Buddhist priest. They had a Native American wedding ring kind of ceremony. It was just a mixed match of all kinds of different religions and cultures. And it was just basically all about inclusivity. It was about everything belongs, everything is wonderful, and they didn't want to leave anything out. The very, very best part is that George's best friends from Star Trek were actually able to make it to the wedding. Walter Coing and Nichelle Nichols, they served as the best man and the best woman, respectively, and were able to celebrate Brad and George on what, presumably the biggest day of their lives. Now, on October 13th, 2009, Brad and George became the very first openly gay couple to be contestants on the show The Newlywed Game, which I thought was super, super fun. Y'all, if you look up their episode, it is so freaking adorable. You can see just how much they really do know each other, and just how in sync they really are. And you can definitely see that Brad is 100% the one that takes care of George. Absolutely freaking adorable. Just their chemistry and the way that they interact together is so sweet. I just love it so very much. Though George had initially suggested that Brad just hyphenate his last name, Brad felt like he really wanted to honor George, and also. He just thought George's last name suited him better. So, 2 years after they got married, Brad officially changed his last name from Allman to Takei. So he is no longer Brad Allman, he is now Brad Takei. Though they had been together for decades by this point, the public still didn't know much about them as a couple and barely knew who Brad was at all. Up until this point, Brad had been very much a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, and nobody really knew who he was at all. Like, everybody was pretty aware of who George was. I mean, like, everybody knows who George Takei is, right? But George felt like he wanted to introduce his husband to the world. So, in January of 2014, To Be Takei aired. It was a documentary film that did a deep dive into their life together, into their dynamic, into their backstory. I mean, if you are interested, you should definitely go look it up. Really, really great. And it gives you such a sense of who they are as people and who they are as a couple. It also kind of deep dives into what it was like and the kind of toll that it took on them to have to hide such a big part of themselves for so long. Now, when it comes to Brad, he was kind of a little bit nonchalant about it because, he was in love, he had what he wanted. So he was basically able to just kind of compartmentalize it and kind of get over it. But for George, it was really, really difficult to hide such a big part of himself for so very long. But even more than that, even more than just introducing them as a couple to the world, it was about activism, right? George wanted to shine a little bit of light on how difficult and how the LGBTQIA plus community had suffered for so much for so long because they had been denied the right to love who they wanted to love. And this really led to George really taking a stand and really diving into raising awareness and advocating for the LGBTQ community. George said, "Maybe if our documentary showed we're just like everyone else, just the same gender, maybe, just maybe, fair-minded people will think twice about wanting to discriminate against the LGBT community." Guys, on November 14th, 2014, they were honored with a shared International Vanguard Award for their LGBTQIA plus advocacy work. George took that opportunity at the awards ceremony to gush about Mr. Hubby just a little bit. And I really, truly feel blessed, most blessed, because I have the love of this wonderful guy. He's my husband. We're married, but we're also professional partners in life. We built our lives and our careers together, and I feel so blessed in having him, and I feel very blessed to be gay. In April of 2015, they once again invited the world back into their home, this time just to kind of show off their everyday kind of lives. You get to see just how much Brad really does mother the crap out of George. He's like Susie Homemaker, but in a pair of slacks. I freaking love it. Their dynamic is so adorable. Y'all, in conclusion, I like to find a quote that I think sums up the entire story, and today's quote comes from George, and it's on reflecting how it feels to have one of the most successful relationships in Hollywood. He says, "In any marriage, there is give and take. At first, there is lust, and it turns into love. Then it turns into comfort. Especially when you've been with someone for 33 years. It's about making the loving sacrifices." And that is just a perfect way to end today's video. Guys, I loved today's story so very much. I hope you did just as much. Guys, this is the finished look. What do we think? Do we like it? Do we love it? Let me know in the comments below. I am so grateful. I love you so much. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me today. You guys, it's like my favorite part of the week. It's my favorite part of the day for sure. Getting to come and sit down and talk to you guys for a little bit. I love today's makeup. I love today's story, and I love you so very much. Guys, if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to give it a big old thumbs up before you leave. Make sure you subscribe if you have not already. And as always, no filters, no fancy lighting. It is just me sitting in front of my camera telling you guys an epic love story. Hoping you guys are enjoying what I'm doing. Until next time, my beautiful, amazing Loverlies, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and remember, You're important. Bye.